Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn, and today we have a very moving and perhaps difficult conversation where we're joined by Marc Tobin and Jodi Wachspress, both of whom lost their spouses to cancer over the past 2 years.
We've been wanting to do an episode on widowhood even before the war, and now we need to acknowledge that 6 months into this war, it's really hard to believe, half a year, and there are many, many, many more widows and even some widowers as a result of all the lost lives in this war. And we really want to acknowledge the widows of all ages. We did not interview young widows. It's quite soon, but we do have two very insightful, wise guests who came to talk to us about what we really wanted to discuss, which is being able to create and build a life with somebody new, to build intimacy again.
Yeah, I thought it was very, very important. And the truth is, Tali, I don't remember an episode of any podcast I ever did where I spoke as little as on this one. And there are certainly halachic and hashkafic issues to talk about when it comes to widowhood. You can talk about the issue of chalitza, which is the need to do a ceremony with the brother of a dead husband if the couple has no children. There are questions about where they should be buried if someone remarries. There are questions about a kohen, why a kohen is allowed to marry a widow but not allowed to marry a divorcee. All of these are interesting, but frankly, in this conversation, completely irrelevant, because this is not a deep halachic or hashkafic conversation. This is a chance to listen. This was my chance to listen and really hear people who, as you said, are wise, thoughtful, and deep, talking about their experience of grief, their experience of carrying their spouse forward, even as they try to continue with life after their spouse is gone.
Yeah, I think that we really tried to sit back and let our guests tell their stories. I am sure that there is a lot more to say, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions that our listeners will have. And if we receive that feedback, we will be happy to provide another episode on this topic. But for this particular episode, we really learned a lot just by being there and by letting our friends, Marc and Jodi, tell their stories. Marc Tobin is a very good family friend, and his wife, Jodi, was a dear, dear friend. And I think that many listeners will be familiar with Dr. Jodi Tobin, who was also a very popular teacher of Torah. Jodi Wachspress is also a friend and a colleague. She's also a couples therapist and a sex therapist.
We're very moved and thankful that they agreed to speak with us. And here's our conversation. Marc Tobin and Jodi Wachspress, thank you very much for joining us today on Intimate Judaism.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
My good friends, Marc and Jodi. Marc, we were speaking about Jodi Tobin, who was a dear friend, your wife, and we talked about you coming on and talking about your story of widowhood and loss, and also about what it might be like to consider love again. That's something that we have talked about together. And I thought that it was really touching that you offered to do that. It was before the war that we even talked about it. And now here we are with so many war widows of all ages. As we get older, and I'm now in my early 60s, and I have a few friends who are widows. That's just how it works, widows and widowers. But I never thought that our daughters, Marc, in their 20s, and Jodi, you also have kids in their 20s, they're good friends with widows. And it's really an opportunity now to acknowledge widowhood of all ages and to hear your stories. So I thought maybe we could open with you, Marc, and then you, Jodi, talking a little bit about what it is to have this sort of loss in your life.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And when we talked about it, I think my inclination was to try to give people an understanding of what it's like, but also to kind of get rid of the stigma and to understand what life is like when you lose a spouse. Just to give you my background, I was married to my wife for 29 years and almost 3 weeks. we had a great friendship. We had a great romance. I like to for until January 7th, 2019. I always thought of my life as a romantic comedy. Me being more the comedian side, and my wife being more the romantic side. Um, but when you get news like we got that she had diagnosed with cancer, it puts a lot of perspective in where things are going. Of course, you're optimistic and you go through all the levels of, okay, it's not going to be so bad. And your friends tell you that cancer today is not what cancer was 10 years ago, and people would live with breast cancer and all things like that. But of course, underlying there's the gut punch. And for me, Jodi was much more, I would say, positive, and everything's going to be okay. And this is, very emuni. And I think that that's how she lived her life with cancer. She lived her life before cancer that way. So certainly cancer wasn't going to stop her. Um, but going through the process of, first of all, going through we went through 9 months of chemo and radiation and surgery, and then being told by the doctor in November, I think it was October of 2019, that she was in remission, and that was it. It was like we were done, and you have this big weight off your head, and you don't think about it anymore. A year later, she started developing some back pain, and nobody thought that the cancer was coming back, and the cancer had come back because we were done. That's the way it works with breast cancer. You get breast cancer, you treat it, and you're done. Or at least we thought, or at least everybody told us. Then during her remission, her year of remission was COVID. And, I look at that, everybody looks at COVID differently, but for me, COVID was the ultimate, blessing. Here I got to spend whatever, 7, 8 months straight, just me and Jodi in the house. We did have two of our kids here, but they didn't really want to pay attention to us, and we didn't necessarily pay attention to them. But we got to further develop our relationship, and that was just an amazing thing. And then the cancer, I don't think the cancer ever left, but the cancer reappeared, and that was very hard. In fact, I think when it came back, I think it was harder for me than the first time we got the diagnosis, because the reality hits, and all of a sudden now that the chance of beating cancer and the second time is a lot less than the first time. And whenever you start to go through that whole process, I would say even subconsciously, I started going through a grieving process when she got that second diagnosis. And even though I was positive, and even though we had great things that were going on, during her first diagnosis, our son got engaged 2 days after her first treatment. And then, he got married right at the end of the treatment. And then our son got engaged, and we had a COVID wedding. And then our daughter got engaged during after the second diagnosis. And we had another wedding, and we lived life like cancer was just part of the life, because we said, okay, chronic disease, we're going to live with chronic disease. And as she got physically more compromised, it became my pleasure, or my zchut, to be able to take care of her. And obviously our relationship changed in a certain way, in the sense that now I was the primary caregiver, but we tried to maintain that husband-wife relationship. And I remember I was talking to a good friend of mine at one point about getting an aide. And he said, you want to be the husband, you don't want to be the caretaker. But as a spouse, and I'm sure Jodi feels this way also, you don't really want to give someone else those tasks. You want to do it yourself, because this is the person that not only love more than anything else, but that you're connected to. It really is basar echat when you get married and you have a good, strong relationship. So it was very difficult for me to give over tasks. I was at all the treatments. I was the one who knew all the numbers. Jodi was the Amuna person, and I was the number person. I knew every one of her blood numbers. I didn't have nobody needed to tell me what the numbers meant. I consulted with doctors, I called people, I had no inhibitions. I read a paper by a doctor at Yale, and I sent her an email at 7:30 in the morning. She responded. And she said, I can talk to you. I got on the phone and I was talking to oncologists all over the country. It's in America, in Israel too. I did everything I could. And I think as a result of that, when Dodi eventually, when she passed away, I didn't have any feeling of I didn't do enough. I had a feeling of, okay, this is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us this, and she had this incredible emunah, and I kept that going, I think. And so for me, the grief was twofold. I think there was the initial grief of when she passed away, obviously the longing and the missing, and the other thing was I still had to go on because I had 4 children, I had 2 grandchildren. I was part of a community. I didn't want to be the nebuch. I didn't want to be the person that people thought that, here I was this person that during her illness we were strong, so we were going to be strong going forward. I was going to be this model for people to show them how you could be sad and happy all at the same time. My son Matan was living with me, so he was my designated partner at home. And it was only this year, I think, I had a back injury, and I had a lot of time to be by myself and a lot of time to sit with myself, that the grief really surfaced, and the enormity of losing Dodi really hit me. And it was very difficult. And I described to my therapist, it was PTSD for me, like getting my back injury. All of a sudden, now I had to really confront all those things that I lost Dodi. For the first year, I couldn't do enough things in her memory. I sponsored shiurim every month. I dedicated a book to her. I was taking some of her shiurim and turning them into books. I started building a Beit Midrash in Beit Shemesh in her memory. And I think that, looking back on it, that was partly because I couldn't let her go. I couldn't say, she's not here. And just like during our 29 years of marriage, my primary concern was making sure, Dodi was happy and fulfilled. For the first, I guess, year and a half, all I wanted to do was make sure that she was still happy and still fulfilled. And so my grief, I think I put on the back burner, and I allowed myself to keep on going and going and going. And I certainly didn't want my kids to see that I was not going to be okay and things like that. And I think this year I finally had to, the last couple of months has finally had to start dealing with the enormity and the grief. It so happens that it coincided with me a year after Dodi passed away, after the Yortzeit, after Rosh Hashanah, that I said I was finally ready to start dating, to find somebody. I found a wonderful person and a wonderful, partner now. But it doesn't take away the sadness. It doesn't take away the grief. It doesn't take away anything. The grief doesn't go away even though you find someone. It just the sadness, I think I've been able to deal with my happiness with this sadness, and understanding that I'm not leaving Dodi. Dodi's still with me, but she's with me in a different way. I always say that if Dodi and I had met each other when we were, whatever, 56 years old, if we had gone back in time and met ourselves as 25-year-olds when we first met each other, we wouldn't recognize those people. So I recognize that the person I am today is in large measure because I was married to Dodi. And so Dodi can't go away. That's who I am. And that's a real big part of me. And I don't think it's a part of me that'll leave. It definitely gets put in a different box, but it doesn't go away.
Thank you, Marc, for that very deep and moving description of what you've gone through. There's a lot there we can talk about afterwards. First, I'd like to ask Jodi to tell her story, if that's all right, Jodi, and maybe tell us about what you experienced, what transpired with your husband, Josh.
Thank you. I'm actually very impressed with you, Marc, for being able to get that story out so eloquently. As you're speaking, I'm thinking I'm going to choke. So I hope I don't choke. My husband was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in September of 2022. It was very, very sudden. He's a very strong, big man in a lot of ways. And we went on a trip to the States, and he stayed for a conference for a few days and came back 5 kilo 5 kilo less. And by that Shabbos, we were in the hospital and pretty much had a diagnosis. So there was a very stark shift in our lives, that sort of happened in the blink of an eye, which is, I think, a lot of people's fears. Like it's a scary story. It's a scary beginning. I remember walking into the oncology ward for the first time, and just like, it was a new oncology ward in Shaare Zedek. So it was a new building. It was still under construction. And we just like took each other's hands and we're like, okay, we got this. We're going to get through this. And similar to what Marc said, a lot of people try to comfort you by saying, this is just going to be a blip in your history. You're going to get through it. You got to, be strong, and you're going to get through it. And a year from now, you're going to be making a Sudat Hodaya, and you're going to be so grateful. And I think I really appreciated that at the time. It also wasn't realistic for a lot of people. So I felt like, if I would go back and be able to talk to myself, I would say to myself, yes, this might be the case, and think about what, your coping mechanisms and what you can do, and, as you go through. So something that I also think people don't speak about is that relationships are relationships no matter what, and marriages, go through all different types of periods and experiences. And, as your kids are getting married, and, because I'm also, my kid, we have, thank God, 2 kids. Today's my son and daughter-in-law's anniversary, their second anniversary. And when cancer happens, everything else stops. Not for real, but in your logistic day-to-day, everything else gets put on pause. And I became a full-time caretaker from the beginning. We unfortunately did not have any ability to live our life alongside cancer, which we were hoping. A lot of people said, do family pictures, go on a vacation, take some time together. We didn't have that opportunity, because from the moment he was diagnosed, he was suffering until the moment that he died. And intimacy changes. If we're here speaking about intimacy changes. You have the opportunity that no one ever wants this opportunity, but when you have it, you can look back and see it as like Marc said, like as a bracha, to be able to develop a different kind of intimacy where no matter what, I am here for you. And you know that no matter what, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in and out of the hospital, Shabbos, no Shabbos, Chag, no Chag, 100%, it's a very, very intimate experience to sort of care for your spouse when they're suffering, and going up and down with the hope and then no hope. Josh did not recognize that he was dying. He didn't accept that he was dying until Yom HaAtzmaut a year ago. My kids finished saying Kaddish on Shabbos, where he deteriorated significantly. He did not accept the fact that he was dying. So I was holding that by myself, because I knew that from Hanukkah. And it's a very lonely experience, because you want to be able to be there, and you want to be supportive, and you want to be hopeful. And you're also holding this other reality of your life is, this is, you live for the here and now, right now. We saw a psychiatrist, a oncology psychiatrist, a few times, the two of us and with the kids. And one of the things that he spoke about is the process of detachment. When somebody recognizes that they are going to die, they gradually detach from the world around them. And he encouraged us to recognize that, and I say us, I mean me and my kids, to recognize that that's healthy. Not that anything sounds healthy when you're dying of cancer, but that we're going to watch him start detaching from community. Won't want to see friends as much. He won't want to talk about work. By the way, that never happened. Josh and his work were hand in hand until the last second, and his patients know that. But that was, he started to detach from community, started to detach from, the days of the week, started the times of the day, and gradually starting to detach from the family. And we had to recognize and accept that as a process that he needed to do, and we needed to do it for him. And like Marc said, once he died, I had to be the alive one. I had to be the one that continued to live. I had to be, just like you said, Marc, I was strong with him during the cancer process. I did whatever needed to be done. And I'm the same person. So once he died, I still needed to be myself. I still needed to be the strong one and to take on, all of the roles that you don't have as part of a couple. So for me, that was, all the financial stuff, all the, the house repairs, and, there's so many things that he took care of that I never took care of, and I needed to take that on, and I need to do a really good job at it. And I needed to be a role model for my kids. And I needed to learn, we talk about relationality and family dynamics. I needed to learn how to be a different kind of I'm still learning how to be a different kind of a mother to my kids at different stages in their lives, how to let them do what they need to do and also accept their help, and vice versa. And it's a challenge, that we're continuing to have. And when we talk about, in terms of like lahansiach, like to keep his memory alive, we're working on achnasat Sefer Torah, because that was Josh's dream, to lachnis the Sefer Torah, and Bezrat Hashem on Yom Yerushalayim, on his Yartzeit Erev Yom Yerushalayim, we'll be doing that. It's his dream. It wasn't my dream. I'm doing what I need to do for him and for my kids. And sometimes that means I have to put myself aside a little bit. And those are moments that are difficult, even though I know it's the right thing to do. So holding on to the relationship and to the intimacy and into the family intimacy and community intimacy are all challenges. Being able to move on and to see that that life can continue and there can be love again. I believe that firmly. Thank God, I'm also dating someone right now, and it's a whole new experience. It's a whole new experience with a different person and a different family dynamic, and there are a lot of challenges there. So I think that that's something that we really need to speak about and to bring up. I think that the younger widows, there are different stages of marriage. And early marriage, there's a lot of, passionate love, and a lot of, the Dvar Torah of the Gila, Rina, Ditza, V'chedva, and, that those early stages of relationships are so exciting and so passionate. By the way, I used to give that Dvar Torah all the time as a couples therapist. I say it's spiral. You can keep coming back to the Gila, Rina. You don't like lose it with time. With that being said, early younger widows haven't gone through full life. They haven't gone through the progression of marriage. And very often they're in this, like, our dreams. And as a 52-year-old woman who's lived a lot of her life, it's a very different place to be in.
Thank you so much, Jodi, and thank you, Marc, for telling your stories. Both of you mentioned that you're in new relationships, and we are here to talk about building a new relationship after such loss. I really appreciated how each of you mentioned about how intimacy changed, how you went through stages together as caregivers, and how you really did this process of detaching. And you can certainly talk more about that, because that's actually very, very interesting to understand more about. But I also want to acknowledge, and this is especially true for younger widows, but it's also true for older widows, that sometimes there is no process. Sometimes it happens in an immediate way, and there's an added element of real trauma. Not that cancer is not a trauma as well, but it's different because you're processing it as you go along in ways that when it happens kind of immediately, you don't get that opportunity. So I guess I wonder, and I do want to mention, Jodi, that you are a couples therapist and a sex therapist. We're colleagues as well as friends. And so you certainly can answer this from a professional perspective. But I actually wonder about the differences in loss in terms of the readiness to build something new. And also, and you can talk from your personal experiences. How do you know when you're ready? I think, Marc, you told me the joke that at the Shiva, it's too early, but by Shloshim, it's too late. And that's certainly true for guys. I don't know how true it is for women, but how do you know when you're ready? What about your kid? I think that there's a lot of questions that come up, and I'm sure you, Scott, want to bring up questions as well. And also, I guess the obvious question of, you were talking, Marc, about how Jodi is so much part of you. She's part of your identity. You're Jodi's husband. That's your identity. And that's, I think, an identity that you're always going to carry. So she's going to be there with you. Bezrat Hashem, you and Dina are going to be together. And it's like that there's another person there with you. I guess these are the kind of questions that I'd love for you both to comment on.
I just want to say that one thing is that someone said to me at the Shiva, uh, actually, Dr. Tova Lichtenstein said to me at the Shiva, at Dodi Shiva, she said, it doesn't matter if you're 85, if you're 55, or if you're 25. When you lose a spouse, you lose half of your identity. And it really is true, I think. And the other thing I wanted to say is that each person's situation is completely different. Losing a spouse is completely different when you're 35 and you have young children, when you're 56 and you have grown children that are married. Um, it's different if you're 56 and you have no children that are married and they're all living at home. It's different. Every situation is different. It's different if you had, like I had, 9 months of time to say goodbye, as opposed to, I don't know how people deal with immediacy of death. I don't know how that happens. And I think that that's one thing that you can't group anybody together. My situation and Jodi's situation, while they seem very similar, are completely different. And not just because we're different people. It's just different. Each person has their different experience. People ask me, a lot of times, and I don't know if this happens to you, Jodi, they said, did you have the conversation? And I said, no, we didn't have the conversation because we didn't think she was going to die. Why would we have thought she was going to die? Why couldn't she be the one that didn't die? We had one conversation, I remember, a couple of like 10 days before Dodi died, and she just looked at me and said, what's going to happen with my life? And that was the only time during the whole process that she showed any kind of, what's going to happen attitude. And I just said, Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to take care of you. That's what's going to happen. And the most she would say to me when I was going through, my difficult times, because it's also hard as a caretaker to break down, because you don't want your spouse who's going through much worse than you to see you breaking down and cause them pain, is she would say to me, it's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And I remember I said it, I think I said it at the funeral. I said, she told me it's going to be okay. So it's going to be okay. And I think that each person's situation is different. And I think you have to have a lot of, fortitude to be able to move from that point of grief and allow yourself to be sad. I think in society, we don't necessarily allow ourselves to be sad. My therapist said to me recently, he said, you just have to be able to live with being sad. That's part of, that part. I just had two babies. My oldest son had a girl, named the baby Dodi. Yes, I was extremely happy, but I was extremely sad. But it's okay. I can do that. And I think for me, getting to the point this past Rosh Hashanah, I just said, okay, I need to live. I need to move forward. I can't be looking in the past. I need to be going forward. Right after Dodi's Yortzeit, I took my ring off. And I thought it would be a big event, but I just woke up in the morning, I took it off and I said, okay, I've done my Avelus. I've done that. And I think that, if we think about it from the tremendous gift that Chazal give us, is this idea of Avelus, because Avelus does have, the minhagim were very strong, but it also ends. Chazal understood that it ends. And I always say that, how could it be that a spouse grieves for 30 days and a child grieves for a whole year? How is that possible? And then I realized one day that if if we as a spouse had to have 12 months of Avelus, we would never go out. We would never get up. We would have nothing. Could you imagine going through life, not being able to go out with friends and not being able to have any kind of social interaction for a whole year? It's not like with your kids that, they have a spouse, so they're always going to be with somebody. You'd be sitting alone by yourself a lot of times. And I think that that's a true gift that Chazal gave us, that as a spouse, it's like, okay, it's time to get up. It's time to move forward. And I don't think it's moving on. I think it's moving forward because, like I said before, Jodi's always going to be there. There are times when I'm going through things now that I laugh and say, this was your job, Dodi. Why am I doing this? Unlike it's like the housework and the money things, it's more on the emotional things, and it's more on the certain things that you have to deal with your children, and you have to deal with that. But I think it is moving forward, and I think the desire for me at Rosh Hashanah to start dating was not a desire to fill a void, but it's because I loved being in love with Jodi. And I missed that feeling. And it wasn't like I was going to replace Jodi, but I needed that intimacy. And the intimacy is not on a physical level. The intimacy is on an emotional level. There's no intimacy like between a husband and wife. When you find out that you're, pregnant, and you have those couple of months where nobody else knows and you have this secret, it's an incredible thing. It's just this thing that you share that nobody else knows about. Or when you see your kid doing something either completely stupid, completely goofy, or incredible, and the two of you are the only ones that know about that. That is like beyond that feeling. I was lucky that I had it. And that was something that, even though I only had it for 29 years, it's never going to go away that I had that. I know I'm not going to find Jodi again, but that's okay because I had Jodi. And now I am at the age of 57. I have a lot of life to live, and there's new adventures and new exploration and new things to happen, and so I think that's where my mindset is, that I'm not leaving Jodi. I'm bringing Jodi along for the ride. It's unfortunate for Dina that sometimes maybe difficult, but I'm not trying to compare anybody. I'm not trying to compare her. I'm not trying to make her something else. That's just the way it is. I had a great thing, and so why wouldn't I want to find that again?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on what, the conversation that you spoke about, or that people ask all the time. Did you have the conversation? And, it's code word for, or did your spouse give you permission to get married again? And we used to laugh about I don't know if anybody remembers Everybody Loves Raymond, the TV show, which is one of the best TV shows ever created. And we actually rewatched it, like the entire 8,000 seasons when we were in the hospital. And in one of the episodes, they talk about that. They talk about, who would you choose if I would die? And it's this whole funny episode. And it makes me think of the talk, right? We have the conversation about death, and then life, and then we have the talk, and we talk about talking to our kids about sex and sexuality. Did you have the talk? And the talk with our kids, we know now, is not a one-time talk. We don't just tell them, what happens, how do you make babies, and that's it. It's an ongoing conversation that we need to have with our kids over the years. And I think the conversation is the same thing. It's not, at least for us, or maybe I can say for me, it wasn't just sitting, do you want me to get married? Yes, of course. I know he wanted me to remarry, and he wanted me to be happy. He also said straight out to a friend of ours who asked him, asked him, he spoke to him about it. And he said, Jodi's going to get remarried at one point. She's not going to be alone forever. And Josh said to him, dude, I'm still alive. He's like, yeah, but I'm still here. So I don't want to talk about that right now. So for us, the conversation sort of was in the background. And my mother-in-law did say at the Shiva, or even on the way to the funeral, she said, I know that Jodi's going to get remarried. At the same time, while I know that they feel that way, there's a piece of my heart that breaks when I think about, them being, knowing about me moving on and in reality. And so that's something that's difficult in terms of having another person in the relationship. There's always, like you said, Marc, like Josh is always going to be a part of me. He's going to be in who I am until the day I die, which I don't anymore. I don't ever say Mea Vesrim, because who knows? And I have to be realistic. And that's a discussion with my new partner. We talk about that. We talk about how he's always going to be a part of who I am. He's my kid's father, not having him at these events. And I started to get very teary when you were talking about it, Marc, about, weddings, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
But I do think if we go back to talking about different stages of life and being a 52-year-old widow as opposed to a younger widow, I can tap into different coping mechanisms that I've developed throughout my life, coping with other things, with other losses, with other traumatic experiences, with other wonderful experiences. I have the ability, I have to be prepared for it, but I have the ability to go back and say, what worked for you? What helps you when you're in a really difficult place? I know what works for me is, having an exercise routine. That's something that grounds me. It holds me. My work grounds me. My kids ground me. My kids, I don't want them to be the ones that have to ground me, but we ground each other. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is to figure out who you are as a parent to your children who have lost a parent. And that's a big deal.
Thank you both again for your eloquence. You've both mentioned this idea of taking your spouse with you into future relationships. And I'd like to ask a question, which obviously is anecdotal. There's no one answer, about the experience of a new relationship with someone who is not widowed, whether the person was ever married before, perhaps is divorced, and therefore has a very different sort of experience, doesn't have that same sense of loss in the same kind of way. And in a sense, bringing your spouse into a new relationship must be very difficult or challenging in its own way when the person you're with is not bringing in that person's spouse in the same kind of way. And I'm curious if either of you would like to comment on that.
I think in some ways, I think divorce is harder than death. My kids will always know that I absolutely loved their mother, that there was nothing that I wouldn't have done for her, with her. I didn't leave anything on the table. I think when you deal with other, a divorce, for example, which obviously is very traumatic for not only the person who gets divorced, for the children, I think that's more difficult, and obviously every situation is different. It's different, it is a different thing. The doctor told me on March 22nd that Jodi would have a couple of months to live. But I got a couple of months to just do everything I could with her. When someone gets divorced, you don't get those months to do that, or to prepare, or things like that. Look, also, no matter who you're bringing into your life, you have to be sensitive to that person also. It's not a one-way street. I have a friend who lost his wife, and he remarried. His kids were young, and they were all living in the house, and his wife happened to be divorced, and I think they had about 7 or 8 kids living in the house. The ones, his children who had lost their mother, were like, give us a break, we lost our mother. And the others were like, give us a break, our parents got divorced and ripped our family apart. It's a very different experience, but everybody's going through this loss. And I think that when you go on to the next the next stage of, or your next chapter in life, I think everybody has to be sensitive to the other person's needs. And each person's situation is different. And each person's loss is different, because when someone passes away, it's a loss. When divorce happens, it's a loss. It's not, everything doesn't go on. We all think that, everything's going to be perfect. And then, there are different losses, and there's sadness on both sides. And you have to be sensitive to the person that is coming into your life, and their children, and whoever else is there, their in-laws. And I'm very close with my in-laws, and I'm as sensitive as I can be, as happy as they are, as they are for me. I know there's a sensitivity. Not everybody has the same way of looking at things. I hope that answers what you're.
Thank you. Jodi, can you comment on that as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm currently doing a dissertation that I started 4 years ago, and the topic of my research is studying the need for a revised Hadrachat Kalod / sex education for divorced Orthodox Jewish women. So I've been studying this for 4 years, and I'm at a place in my work that it's become very challenging, because I did a tremendous amount of research about divorced Orthodox Jewish women, and specifically did not include widows. And here I am, a widow, and I have all this information, and I'm like working on, okay, what are the differences and similarities for widows and people and women that were divorced, specifically in the Orthodox world, specifically about relationality and how they approach intimacy and sexuality. So I agree with a lot of what Marc is saying. I feel I'm experiencing similar things, that I'm also a daughter of divorce. So that's adds another, another level. Everyone goes through their own crisis and their own trauma whenever a family is sort of fragmented, and living in a world of being a widow, there's there is this sense of this person, we lived not a full life, but we lived a lot of life, and we enjoyed a lot of life, and we held our family together. And I have that as a gift, being a widow, as opposed to some people that are divorced. Some people that have gotten divorced feel like, yeah, we lived a good chunk of our life in a really good way, and we really were strong, and we grew an amazing family. And at a certain point, there was a break, and things changed. It doesn't, I like to really keep an open mind about that, and to look at the strengths in families of divorce and families of loss. I think one of the issues in any kind of perek bet, this is like the term that everyone gives to getting remarried, or relationships after, is the different families are going to be at different paces and at different stages. So for me, I happened to meet someone pretty soon after my husband died, and that was not something that I expected at all. I thought I was just going to sort of dip my toe in the dating pool. And for a lot of people, they feel like, how can you do that? And my partner, whatever we call him as an adult, what do you say? Boyfriend, partner, Ben-Zug, who knows, whatever it is.
I like to use the word chick. I use like chick.
Chick. I don't think I could use the word chick. I don't think that would work. Maybe I can say dude. I can say my guy. His family had a few years to be processing, and they're much more open to sort of like bringing me into their family. And my family, my kids are not ready for that. And, figuring that out and being sensitive to everybody's needs, it's sort of, I say it's like being on skis. I don't like skiing. So maybe people that like skiing would have a better answer for solution. But I feel like I'm on skis, and one of them is going at warp speed, and one of them is just trying to stay where it is. And my job is to be able to tighten my core and hold it all together. So for me, that's my experience of, the difference between widowhood and divorce.
I really appreciate these responses. And in fact, I really appreciate everything that you are saying. not to mention that I'm so moved by everything that you're saying. I think, Jodi, you just made a point that is so important here, because a lot of times people think that if you're widowed, you should look for somebody who's been in a good marriage, because somebody who's not been in a good marriage and is divorced isn't going to be able to get you. And I think that what you're saying is, in a marriage, there may be parts of that marriage that were relational and were positive, and that you can draw on that. A person who has been divorced, it doesn't mean that they're not relational people. And I would say, on the other hand, and this is not true for you guys, but it never does seem to be true, but I'm sure that there are people who are widowed who are not in great marriages. And so we really can't generalize. And I also want to go back to what you said, Marc, because I think what you said earlier is very, very inspiring. I think if there's one maybe message, important take-home message here to people who have suffered loss in their lives, is this idea of the potential for this post-traumatic growth through the idea of connection, through the idea of building a relationship again. But I don't know that we've spent enough time really talking about the challenges in doing that, especially given some of the obvious halachic limitations in building an intimate relationship. And I guess my elephant in the room question, and I think that this is a universal question, whether you keep halacha or don't keep halacha, and I've heard it from clients that I've worked with as well, and you can feel free to answer either from a personal perspective, or you, Jodi, from a professional perspective. But I think the elephant in the room question is, if you've been married for a long time, the idea of being physically intimate with another person after you've, like, your partner knows your body, you know your partner's body, you know everything about each other, you're just comfortable together. Your body's not like a 20-year-old body, everything is different. This is a question that people really want to know about. And I know how I might answer as a relational therapist, but I don't have the actual lived, felt experience of being in that situation. Maybe, Jodi, you want to start?
I can start from a professional standpoint, and from having researched and interviewed a lot of divorced Orthodox Jewish women, and then I can put in a little bit of personal, because personal is personal, and having proper boundaries is very important. We all know that there are a lot of types of intimacy, and physical intimacy is one of them, and sexual intimacy is one of them. And there's also social intimacy, there's aesthetic intimacy, there's verbal intimacy. Okay, I'm gonna pause and rewind for a second. Being in a marriage for a long time, I was married almost 28 years. I believe, as a therapist and as a human being, that we need to relearn our own bodies and our own needs, and our partner's bodies and their needs as we go through life. So we may say, oh, I know that he, enjoys doing this and I enjoy doing this. And, we really connect when we, go for a tulim and we're in nature, or we really connect when we, have a quiet evening alone. And that changes even in a marriage. And I think that that's something that's missed. That's something that's missed very often in marriages. And that's why couples end up coming to couples therapy and marriage therapy. And because they need to be reminded it's okay to sort of pause and reflect. So I think that that's been my approach in a new relationship, is, okay, this is an opportunity to pause and reevaluate myself and different ways that I can connect intimately and what feels right. And yeah, there are a lot of halachic issues there. And I can say this from my research, that a lot of people that I spoke to have a very hard time with the halacha, because they've already been in sexual relationships, and going into a second marriage, or for some people, relationships, they feel like that's a very important part of a relationship. So how can I go in without knowing?
Thank you, Marc.
I won't talk about the physical intimacy, because I think everybody that relates to, that's an individual thing, and what's going on. But I do think that there is an emotional intimacy that happens when you get into a relationship. I remember when I was dating Jodi, I had a very close friend in law school who was a woman. And I remember at one point, Jodi said to me, okay, that's going to stop. Like that, you don't need that relationship anymore. And I was like, well, what do I know? I was an idiot, so what did I know? I just, and I think that that's something that I think is the intimacy that I think happens with a relationship is when you want to share everything with that one person. And that takes time to get to that point. And I'm still figuring it out. And I think we all, when we go through second relationships, we start to figure it out. When Jodi was alive, there was nothing that I wouldn't say to her. Someone said to me, when you're married, and you go to a wedding and you don't like the food, you get in the car and you say to your spouse, that food was terrible. And you don't care if they like the food or not. You just say it because it's your spouse and who cares? You wouldn't say it to a friend because maybe they like the food. But there are certain things that you share with your partner that you won't share with anybody else. Things about your kids, things about your in-laws, things about your parents, things that you're just going to share with that one person because they stay within the couplehood. And I think that that's something that you have to learn how to develop, and have to get that trust and to have to get that, really that intimacy to get there, and to be there. I knew there were certain things that I did that I knew how Jodi was going to react before I even did them. And, as speaking to two therapists and a rabbi, and there were probably certain things that I did knowing that she was going to react that way just to make her react that way because for whatever reason. And I think that that takes time to develop when you start a relationship. Also, when you've been in a relationship and married for 29 years or 28 years or a long period of time, you want that back again. You don't want to wait. There's a little bit of a feeling of, okay, okay, we're done with that. Let's go forward. And I think one of the things that I encounter with some friends, mostly my male friends, my female friends don't say this to me, is they often say to me, "What's the rush? You don't have to rush into anything." And I usually respond, I said, "Oh yeah, because you know what it's like to be alone for a year and a half. You know what that's like to have nobody to talk to. You know what it's like to come home to nobody, to eat dinner by yourself, or try to figure out what you're going to do Friday morning by yourself. There's part of, and I'm not saying that this is default and say, oh, I need to be in a relationship because I don't want to eat dinner by myself. But, you get very accustomed to being with somebody. You get very accustomed to sharing your life, I would say is what it is. That's intimacy when you share your life. And I'm sure there are people that live together and are married that don't share their lives. That's not what I had. I had a full person sharing my life. And I think that that's an intimacy that I'm fortunate right now that I feel that I'm developing, because it's not something like Jodi said. I don't think it's something that it happens overnight. It's something to develop. You see potential, and then you want to develop that potential. And I think not being afraid to develop that potential, to develop a level of intimacy with somebody is something that took me a long time to figure out. And I knew it when I think I knew it when I felt it. And I'm sure for everybody it's different.
Thank you both. And I really appreciate the boundaries around talking about physical intimacy. I'll say something, though. I think that what you said about emotional intimacy, taking time, really taking the time, understanding that it's a process and it's a process to build. And I think that we can apply that as well to that process, that it is a process that, just like it took time the first time around, is likely to take time in the same elements that make physical intimacy as a continuation of emotional intimacy. The communication about it, the ability to feel like you can expose and be authentic, and trial and error, and understanding that there's a whole path. And I say this not for the two of you, because you know this, but I say this for our listeners who might really be worrying and wondering. It's okay that it can take time.
I just want to say something about time, because we know with trauma, there's no En mukdam u'u'char b'Torah and en mukdam u'u'char in trauma and grief and loss. It's not it's not
Not
linear.
linear. Yeah.
It's not linear. It's more like a big scribble. And I think it's important to validate each person's experience of time, because sometimes things feel like they're going very fast, and sometimes it feels like things are taking for like such a long time, and different people experience time differently. I just think that that's an important thing to note and for us to be able to respect.
I'll close up now. There's a lot more we could talk about, but first of all, let me thank you both for being so candid and honest about both your emotions and your experiences. I also want to just mention, the same way that Tali said that a takeaway is this idea of the renewed possibility of connection. I also noted something which may be obvious and simplistic almost, but in the sense that the Ramchal says those things which are most obvious are the things we need to be reminded of. I think of what you said, Marc, when you talked about how you'll always be sad and you can have happiness alongside and together with sadness, that we often think in a cartoonish type of way that you're either happy or sad, or you have one emotion or another. And the complexity of life, the complexity of our emotional reactions, being able to carry that sadness with you, carrying the experience with you, while also experiencing renewed joy, to me is a very important takeaway as well. And I think it adds an element of depth to this entire conversation. So given that, I want to thank both of you again for joining us and for being so honest.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing to close. Like I think you were saying, Scott, is, people have expectations. People have like when I got married, I didn't think I was going to lose my wife when I was 57. All 7 of our 8 grandparents lived into their 90s. We have four parents that are alive in their 80s. Who would have thought that? It wasn't even something that ever crossed my mind. But I think one thing that I heard my sister-in-law, Marcy, say, she said that Jodi made her not afraid of death. And I think my experience with Jodi and going through it with her made me realize that not everybody gets to get to 90, and certainly not everybody gets to have 60 plus years of being married. But that doesn't mean you have to look at that as a bad thing. Meaning, I had a great 29 years, and I know that. And I could have another 30 years with someone now, and that would be great. It won't mean that my first 29 years weren't good, or that my second 30 years are good. I think it's all a matter of how you look at life. If you accept that life is finite and we all have only a certain amount of time, then we have to live it to its fullest. We have to accept that our partner passed away, and we have to accept that, okay, there's another partner for us. We don't think that because this whole concept of beshert is driven into us, that we have one beshert. And look, I believe Jodi was my beshert. She was there. She was the person that I was supposed to create a family with. She was the person who I was supposed to move to Israel with, to create whatever we created that was supposed to happen. But that also led me to my next chapter, because I wouldn't have gotten there without Jodi. And I now have this ability to forge a new chapter. It doesn't mean my first chapter is going to end. It just means my second chapter is going to be that much richer because I had that first chapter. And I think that that's an important thing for people who lose a spouse to understand if they want to go forward, with a new relationship, is that you're not giving up what you had. You're just building upon it.
Really beautiful words. And I just want to wish you both b'hatzlacha going forward in your new relationships, and to anybody listening who is taking those steps, b'hatzlacha.
And thank you to you, all of our listeners, for listening to this very important episode. Check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and please leave a comment as well. Tell people about Intimate Judaism and share this podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Thanks.